The muddy riverbank squelched beneath Wicasa's moccasins as he dragged the damaged birch-bark canoe onto the shore water, streaming from its bullet-riddled hull. In his arms, 2 children clung to his buckskin shirt, 4-year-old Ohanzi, whose dark eyes darted fearfully between the forest behind them and the flickering lights of white pine crossing ahead, and baby Nita, whose soft whimpers had grown weaker with each passing hour. Behind them, across the wide, cold river torch, flames danced between the pine trees. Shouts echoed through the darkness, punctuated by the sharp crack of rifle fire. Tom Bradley and his bounty hunters were still there, still searching their voices, carrying across the water with promises of violence, and the $50 reward that had turned Wicasa from a peaceful traveler into hunted prey. "There's tracks leading to the water." Bradley's harsh voice boomed across the river. "That savage can't have gotten far with them brats." Wicasa's left shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed him during their perilous river crossing, blood seeping through the makeshift bandage he'd torn from his sleeve. His breath came in ragged clouds in the October chill, but his grip on the children never faltered. As he adjusted his hold on Ohanzi, the boy's small hand pressed against something hard beneath his torn shirt, a glint of metal that caught the moonlight. Wicasa's fingers brushed against it, briefly feeling the smooth surface and delicate chain of what seemed like a locket. But with death pursuing them, he dismissed it as some childhood keepsake, nothing more than a comfort item the boy had salvaged from his ruined home. The town of White Pine Crossing sprawled before them like a collection of wooden fortresses, its windows glowing amber against the night. Wicasa knew those windows had passed through the settlement twice before during his travels through the territory. But that was before Sheriff Marcus Coleman had fabricated charges of horse theft against him, before the wanted posters had appeared with his likeness and the promise of bounty money for his capture dead or alive. The accusations were lies born from Coleman's desire to appear tough on Indian troubles and his own greed for the territorial government's anti-native bounties. But in the current climate of fear and suspicion, no white jury would believe a Lakota warrior's word over a sheriff's testimony. A distant howl carried across the water wolves this time, drawn by the scent of blood and turmoil. What Wicasa knew with crushing certainty was that dawn would bring fresh pursuit, and these children, innocent, helpless, already bearing scars from a world that had shown them nothing but cruelty, deserved better than to die in the wilderness because of the price on his head. He adjusted his grip on them, feeling Nita's fevered breath against his neck, and Ohanzi's trembling body pressed against his chest, and began the long walk toward a town that represented their only hope for survival. 3 days earlier, Wicasa had been following deer sign through the scattered remains of what had once been the Morrison homestead, when the sound of crying had stopped him in his tracks. The small log cabin and its outbuildings had been systematically destroyed, not by accident or natural disaster, but by human hands wielding axes, hammers, and pure hatred. The main house had been torn apart board by board, its roof caved in, and its windows smashed to glittering fragments. The barn had been reduced to splinters, its sturdy frame broken apart with methodical precision. Even the vegetable garden had been trampled into mud, every plant uprooted and destroyed. Scattered among the wreckage were personal belongings, torn clothing, broken dishes, children's toys, all bearing the marks of deliberate vandalism. But the sound that had drawn Wicasa wasn't coming from the ruined buildings. It was the urgent wail of a hungry child, echoing from somewhere beneath the collapsed remains of what had once been a root cellar. He'd found them huddled in the partially intact storage space, 2 small figures pressed against the earthen wall like frightened animals. Ohanzi sat with his back braced against the dirt, baby Nita cradled in his thin arms. Their clothes were little more than rags, torn and stained with mud and dried blood. The boy's ribs showed clearly through gaps in his shirt, and the baby's lips were cracked and pale from thirst and exposure. "Please don't hurt us, mister." Ohanzi had whispered, his voice barely audible above his sister's weak cries. "Mama said we should hide here until she comes back, She promised she'd come back for us. The hope in the child's voice had cut through Wicasa like a blade. He'd knelt slowly, keeping his movements gentle, though his experienced eyes were already cataloging the signs of violence that surrounded them. The destruction here hadn't been random. It had been personal, thorough, and vindictive. "How long have you been waiting, little one?" he'd asked in careful English. "I don't know." Ohanzi's eyes, far too old for his young face, had filled with tears. "The bad men came when it was dark. There was shouting and breaking sounds. Mama screamed and told us to run here and hide. She said she'd come get us when it was safe, but she hasn't. I think maybe something bad happened to her too." That's when Wicasa had spotted the woman's body partially concealed beneath a pile of broken lumber 30 yards from the cellar. Her simple brown dress and the careful way she'd been positioned, arms crossed over her chest, eyes closed, spoke of someone who had tried to give her a dignified burial, even in the midst of chaos. After giving the children water from his canteen and the last of his dried venison, Wicasa had examined the scene more carefully. The destruction patterns told a story of systematic hatred. This hadn't been a robbery. Every item had been deliberately destroyed, every personal possession violated and discarded. And the woman's body bore bruises and injuries that made his jaw clench with barely contained anger. She'd been beaten severely before she died, probably while trying to protect her children. As he dug a proper grave for Eliza Morrison using his knife and bare hands, Ohanzi had slowly told him their story. Their mother was the daughter of Harrison Campbell, White Pine Crossing's mayor and most prominent citizen. 5 years ago, she'd fallen in love with and married a Lakota hunter named Dakota, much to her father's shame and fury. Grandpa Campbell said Mama disgraced the family by marrying an Indian. Ohanzi had explained, his small voice trembling. He told her she was no daughter of his if she chose savages over her own people. So we came to live out here, away from town, away from everybody who might tell Grandpa about us. The boy's words had painted a picture that Wicasa knew well, a family caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Mixed-blood children were often the most despised of all. Too native for the white communities, too white for the tribes. Papa was real tall with long black hair in braids. Ohanzi had continued, his eyes brightening with memory. He had scars on his hands from hunting accidents, and he always smelled like pine trees and leather. He taught me to track animals by their footprints, and he said someday he'd take me to meet his people up in the mountains. "What happened to your papa?" Wicasa had asked gently. "He went hunting up north last month. He said he'd bring back meat for winter and furs to trade. But those men came 3 nights ago. They were angry about some cattle that went missing from the big ranches, said Papa and his people were thieves who needed to be taught a lesson. They said we were mongrels who didn't belong nowhere." As Ohanzi spoke, Wicasa noticed the boy's hand, frequently moving to his chest, touching something beneath his shirt with a protective gesture. When asked about it, Ohanzi had simply said it was something Mama had given him to keep safe, something important that he wasn't supposed to show to strangers. Standing over Eliza Morrison's freshly dug grave, as the first stars appeared overhead, Wicasa had made a solemn promise to the dead woman and to himself. These children would not die because of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. He would get them to safety no matter the cost. The carved wooden hawk that hung from a leather cord around his neck, a gift from his grandfather, seemed to grow heavier as he made that vow. His grandfather had taught him that a warrior's word was sacred, more binding than any white man's contract or law. Once given, it could only be fulfilled or carried to the grave. That night, as he'd settled the children in his small camp and built a careful fire for warmth, Ohanzi had asked him about his own family. "Do you have little ones?" the boy had whispered. "No," Wicasa had replied softly. "But I had a sister once about your age. She died during a hard winter when we couldn't hunt. I couldn't save her then, but maybe I can save you now." The boy had nodded solemnly. Papa used to say that the spirits send us what we need when we need it most. Maybe they sent you to help us. What he hadn't expected was how quickly that promise would be tested. The campfire had been built in a natural depression between two fallen logs, its flames carefully banked and shielded from the wind. Wicasa had chosen this spot specifically for its concealment. Travelers could pass within 50 yards and never see the glow. But in the vast darkness of the frontier wilderness, even the most cautious fire could be spotted by determined hunters. The first shot split the night like thunder, the muzzle flash illuminating 3 figures emerging from the tree line with rifles raised. Wicasa rolled sideways, snatching up his own weapon, even as he threw his body protectively over the children. Ohanzi screamed in terror, while baby Nita's wails rose to join her brothers in a chorus of fear. "No, that's him." Tom Bradley's harsh voice boomed across the campsite. "That's the Indian the sheriff's got paper on $50, boys, and I aim to collect every cent." More shots followed immediately, kicking up dirt and bark around their small camp. Wicasa recognized Bradley's voice from descriptions he'd heard. A brutal man who'd turned bounty hunting into a personal campaign of vengeance against all native peoples after losing his brother in a Sioux raid 3 years earlier. His 2 companions, the Garrett brothers, were known throughout the territory for their cruelty. "You boys stay calm now," Bradley called out, his voice dripping with menace. "We got him pinned down. Just need to flush him out proper." Wicasa's mind raced as bullets continued to whine overhead. The children were too young to run, far too small to fight. Their only chance lay in reaching the river and the canoe he'd cached there 2 days earlier. "Listen to me carefully," he whispered urgently to Ohanzi. "I'm going to carry you and your sister to the water. When I tell you to hold on, you hold on like your life depends on it." "Are we going to die?" Ohanzi asked, his voice small and terrified. "No," Wicasa said firmly. "I promised your mama I'd keep you safe, and a Lakota warrior never breaks his word. But you have to be brave for me." The boy nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face, but his jaw was set with determination. In one fluid motion, Wicasa scooped up both children and sprinted toward the river, dodging between trees as bullets whistled past his ears. Behind him, the hunters cursed and gave chase, crashing through the forest like angry bears. "Come out peaceful like redskin," Bradley shouted. "Make this easy on yourself and them half-breed brats." Instead of answering, Wicasa continued his desperate flight. His grandfather had taught him that knowledge of the land was a warrior's greatest weapon, and that lesson served him now as he followed routes invisible to his pursuers. The river appeared ahead through the darkness, its surface reflecting stars. His canoe waited where he'd left it, pulled up into the reeds and covered with branches. In seconds, he'd torn away the camouflage and shoved the vessel into the water, settling the children in the bottom before pushing off with powerful strokes. "There he goes." Bradley's voice carried across the water, followed immediately by a coordinated volley of rifle fire. "Don't let that savage get away." But they were already moving the current, catching the canoe and pulling them toward the distant lights of White Pine Crossing. Behind them, muzzle flashes lit up the shoreline, but the range was increasing with every pull of Wicasa's paddle. For a moment, Wicasa allowed himself to believe they might make it safely across. White Pine Crossing might be hostile territory, but surely someone there would take in 2 innocent children. That hope lasted until Tom Bradley's rifle found its mark and punched the first hole through the hull of his canoe. The river was wider than it appeared from shore, its dark current running fast and cold with autumn runoff. Under normal circumstances, Wicasa could have crossed it easily. But with bullets flying and water pouring through multiple holes in his canoe, these were far from normal circumstances. The first leak began almost immediately, water seeping through the birch bark hull and pooling around the children's feet. Ohanzi whimpered as the cold river water soaked through his thin clothing, while baby Nita's cries grew more frantic. Why is the water coming in?" Ohanzi asked, panic in his voice. "The bad men put holes in our boat," Wicasa explained, paddling harder. but were strong enough to make it across. Another bullet whistled past his left ear close enough that he could feel the wind of its passage. A third shot punched through the birch bark near the bow, creating a second leak that immediately began gushing water. The canoe lurched sideways as a strong cross-current caught it, nearly capsizing, before Wicasa could compensate with a frantic paddle stroke. Ohanzi screamed and clutched at the sides, his small body rigid with terror. In his arms, Nita had stopped crying a silence that was somehow more frightening than her previous wails. "Swim for it, Redskin." Bradley's voice carried clearly across the water. "Let's see how well you float with them half-breed bastards." A fourth shot found flesh instead of bark, the bullet grazing Wicasa's left shoulder and spinning him partially around. Pain flared through his upper body like liquid fire, but he forced himself to keep paddling despite the blood that now ran down his arm. "You're bleeding," Ohanzi cried, seeing the dark stain spreading across Wicasa's shirt. "Just a scratch." Wicasa grunted, though the wound burned fiercely. Warriors get scratched all the time. The town was closer now, its docks and buildings clearly visible in the moonlight. But the canoe was sinking faster with each passing minute, water rising past the children's ankles. Ohanzi was shivering violently, his lips taking on the blue tinge that warned of hypothermia, while Nita had gone ominously quiet. With a final burst of strength, Wicasa drove the failing canoe toward the muddy bank below White Pine Crossing's main street. The vessel struck the shore with a grinding sound, its damaged hull scraping across rocks as momentum carried them onto relatively dry land. They'd made it across, but just barely. The canoe was ruined beyond repair. Behind them, across the dark river torch, flames danced between the trees as Bradley and his men searched for another way to continue their pursuit. Wicasa tore a strip of cloth from his sleeve and bound it tightly around his wounded shoulder. The bleeding had already begun to slow when the wound was superficial, more inconvenience than real danger. But the children were in far worse condition. "Are we safe now?" Ohanzi whispered through chattering teeth. "We're going to be," Wicasa promised, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. "The people in this town will help us." Looking up at the lights of White Pine Crossing, Wicasa shouldered his rifle and lifted the children in his arms once more. The town stretched before them like a maze of potential refuges and certain rejections, each window a gamble with lives that weren't his to lose. Taking a deep breath of the cold night air, Wicasa began the long walk up from the riverbank toward the first house on the outskirts of town. The general store sat at the corner of Main Street and River Road, its hand-painted sign creaking in the wind. Lamplight glowed warmly behind its curtained windows, and smoke rose steadily from the chimney, clear signs that Samuel Morton, the store's owner, was still awake despite the late hour. Wicasa approached the front door carefully, the children heavy in his arms. Ohanzi had stopped shivering, which was somehow more frightening than his earlier distress. The boy's skin was pale and cold, his breathing shallow. Baby Nita felt like a coal in his arms, burning with fever. He knocked on the door, 3 soft raps that wouldn't wake the entire neighborhood, but would carry clearly to anyone inside. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the sleeping town. Footsteps approached from within, accompanied by the scrape of a chair and the soft curse of a man, interrupted in his evening routine. The door opened a crack, revealing a slice of weathered face beneath thinning gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. Samuel Morton peered out suspiciously, his expression shifting from annoyance to recognition to alarm. His eyes widened as he took in the sight of the Lakota warrior standing on his porch, and his hand moved instinctively toward the shotgun, leaning against the wall inside. "You—" Morton sputtered, starting to slam the door shut. "Get away from here. I don't want your kind around my establishment." "Please," Wicasa interrupted, adjusting his grip so Morton could see the children's faces clearly. "These children are sick. They need warmth, food, medicine. I'm not asking for myself, just help for 2 innocent little ones." Morton's gaze flicked to Ohanzi and Nita, and for a moment, something like compassion flickered in his tired eyes. Wicasa could see the internal struggle playing out across the man's features, basic human decency, warring against ingrained prejudice and very real fear. "Look at them," Wicasa pressed. "The boy's just 4 years old. His name is Ohenzi. His sister is barely more than a baby. They've been hiding without food or water for days." But Morton shook his head firmly, his expression hardening. "I can't get involved in this. My business depends on the goodwill of this community. If word got out that I harbored a wanted man, I'm sorry, but I can't risk everything I've built. These children are dying." Wicasa said, his voice steady despite the urgency clawing at his chest. "Not my problem." Morton snapped, though his eyes avoided looking directly at the children. "You want help? Turn yourself into the sheriff. Maybe he'll get them kids to an orphanage before he strings you up." The door slammed shut with finality, leaving Wicasa standing alone with 2 dying children in his arms. Ohenzi stirred weakly. "Why won't he help us?" the boy murmured. "Some people let fear make their choices for them," Wicasa said gently. He tried the bakery next, where Martha Williams peered through her window before pretending not to be home. Her rejection was silent, but no less absolute. The extinguished lamp and drawn curtains spoke louder than words. At the blacksmith's shop, Jakob Miller opened his door with a pistol in his hand. "Get those diseased half-breeds away from decent folk," he said in heavily accented English, "before they contaminate the whole town with their savage blood." Each rejection cut deeper than the last. At Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, the elderly woman actually stepped onto her porch, her face softening as she saw the children's condition. But when her neighbor Mrs. Crane appeared and hissed warnings about Indian lovers and people who'd help murderers, Henderson retreated quickly inside, muttering apologies through the closed door. At each rejection, Ohenzi's questions grew more heartbroken. "Don't they care that Nita is sick? Don't they care that we're cold and hungry?" Fear makes people forget how to be kind. Wicasa explained, though the words tasted bitter. "They're afraid of what others will think, afraid of losing what they have." The house of Dr. Samuel Morrison proved more painful than the others. The doctor actually examined the children through his window, his professional instincts clearly warring against his social prejudices. For nearly 5 minutes, he stood there studying Nita's fevered face and Ohenzi's blue-tinged lips. "They need immediate attention," Morrison finally called through the glass. "The boy is hypothermic and the baby shows signs of pneumonia. Without treatment, they won't last the night." "And then help them," Wicasa pleaded. "You took an oath to heal the sick. These children are innocent." Morrison's face crumpled with genuine anguish. "Don't you think I want to? Don't you think this tears at everything I believe in? But the town council pays my salary, and they've made their position crystal clear regarding Indians and their associates. If I help you, they'll run me out of town. I have my own family to think about, my own practice to protect. I'm sorry, but I can't risk everything I've built for 2 children who aren't even—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Who aren't even white enough to matter." Wicasa finished for him, his voice devoid of emotion. Morrison flinched as if struck. "That's not— I didn't say that. You didn't have to." By the time Wicasa had tried a dozen doors, word of his presence had spread through White Pine Crossing like wildfire. Sheriff Marcus Coleman and his 2 deputies were patrolling the streets, now their rifles ready. "He's here somewhere," Coleman was saying as his group passed near the alley where Wicasa had taken shelter. "Tom Bradley sent word across the river, says the Indian's armed and dangerous, probably planning to hole up somewhere until morning. Either way, he's worth $50 to whoever brings him in." "What about them kids he's got?" asked Deputy Franklin, a nervous young man whose voice cracked with excitement. "They're half-breed bastards," Coleman replied with casual cruelty. "Probably diseased like their kind usually are." do the town a favor to put them out of their misery, along with their protector. "Are dead's easier than alive," agreed Deputy Harris, the sheriff's nephew. "Less paperwork and no chance of them causing trouble later." Wicasa held his breath as the patrol passed, pressing the children closer to his chest. As they moved on, he realized that Ohanze was barely conscious now, his breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. Nita felt like she was burning up her small body, radiating dangerous heat. The smokehouse behind Heinrich's butcher shop was a desperate gamble, but urgency had stripped away his caution. He set the children down gently behind a pile of firewood and picked the simple lock with his knife blade. Inside, sides of beef and pork hung from hooks, while strings of sausages filled the air with the rich scent of smoke-cured meat. He was reaching for a small piece of dried beef when the dogs started barking. The sound erupted from everywhere at once, a chorus of angry howls that shattered the night stillness. Guard dogs came charging around the corner with their teeth bared and hackles raised. Wicasa dropped the meat and lunged for the door, but he was too late. Lights were already coming on in Heinrich's house, and voices were shouting from neighboring buildings as the entire block woke to the alarm. He snatched up the children and ran, ignoring the pain in his wounded shoulder as he sprinted through back alleys and side streets. Behind him, men's voices grew louder and more organized as Sheriff Coleman took charge of the manhunt. "He's in the commercial district," Coleman shouted. "Spread out and check every building." But Wicasa knew White Pine Crossing from his previous visits. He used that knowledge now, ducking through gaps between buildings and emerging blocks, away from where the search was concentrated. Dawn was approaching, painting the eastern horizon with pale light. Soon the entire town would be awake, and his chances of finding help would drop to zero. There was only one place left to try. The church sat on a small hill overlooking Main Street, its white-painted walls and simple wooden cross marking it as a place supposedly dedicated to sanctuary and compassion. If anyone in White Pine Crossing would help two innocent children, surely it would be the man who preached about love and mercy every Sunday. As Wicasa climbed the hill, Ohanze stirred in his arms and whispered, "Are we going to see God now?" "Maybe," Wicasa replied softly. "But first, we're going to see his helper, and hopefully he remembers what his book says about helping children." Father Michael O'Brien had been awake since before dawn, as was his custom during the autumn months. He was a thin man in his 50s, with prematurely gray hair and hands that bore the calluses of physical labor as much as spiritual work. When Wicasa knocked on the church door, Father O'Brien opened it without hesitation. His eyes took in the scene, the wounded Lakota warrior, the pale and fevered children, the desperation written across all their faces, and his expression immediately softened with genuine compassion. "Come in, my son," he said, stepping aside to allow them entry. "You look like you've traveled through hell itself." The interior of the church was simple, but warm, with wooden pews arranged before a modest altar topped by a hand-carved crucifix. Sunlight streamed through plain glass windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. Wicasa laid the children on the front pew with infinite care. Ohanze's skin was gray and cold, his lips blue with hypothermia. Nita burned with fever, her small body racked by occasional tremors. "They need help, Father." Wicasa said, his voice hoarse from hours of pleading at closed doors. "Food, medicine, warmth, anything you can spare. I've tried everywhere else in town. I can see what they need." Father O'Brien said gently, kneeling beside the pew to examine the children. "The boy is suffering from severe exposure and hypothermia. The baby has symptoms that suggest pneumonia. Both conditions are serious, potentially fatal, but treatable if we act quickly." Hope flared in Wicasa's chest for the first time since crossing the river. Here finally was someone who saw past the color of his skin to the humanity of their desperate situation. But that hope began to die as Father O'Brien continued speaking, his voice heavy with reluctance. "However," the priest said, rising to his feet with obvious internal struggle, I cannot offer you sanctuary here. The people of this town, they would not understand such a decision. Father O'Brien's voice grew more pained as he continued. You must understand, I've spent 15 years building trust in this community. Without their support, this church cannot serve anyone. The food for the hungry, the shelter for the homeless, all of it depends on their acceptance. He began pacing, his internal struggle visible. If I harbor a wanted man, if I involve myself in whatever conflict has brought you here, it will destroy everything I've built. The bishop will remove me, the congregation will scatter, and the good works we do here will cease to exist. But Father Wicasa interrupted. Surely your God values the life of innocent children. Don't you think I know that? O'Brien snapped and then immediately softened his tone. Don't you think this tears at my very soul? But I cannot sacrifice the spiritual welfare of an entire community for the sake of 2 children, no matter how innocent. The words hit Wicasa like physical blows. Even here, in a place supposedly dedicated to mercy and compassion, fear and prejudice held sway over Christian charity. As the priest's words sank in, Wicasa felt the weight of failure crushing down on him. He was going to lose these children, just as he'd lost his sister all those years ago. The promise he'd made to their dead mother would die with them in the wilderness. But then he remembered Ohanzi's words about the object hidden beneath his shirt, something his mother had given him to keep safe, something that might help them if they ever got in real trouble. Perhaps this was that moment. Wicasa knelt beside Ohanzi and gently touched the boy's chest, where the hard object pressed against his shirt. Ohanzi, he said softly. Your mama told you to keep something safe, didn't she? Something important. The boy nodded weakly, his hand moving protectively to his chest. I think now might be the time to show it, Wicasa said. Your mama said it might help if you were ever in real trouble. Well, we're in real trouble now. With trembling fingers, Ohanzi reached beneath his shirt and pulled out a small silver locket on a delicate chain. The metal caught the morning sunlight, streaming through the church windows, gleaming like a beacon of hope. Father O'Brien gasped audibly as he saw the locket, recognizing it immediately. Where did you get this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Wicasa opened the locket, carefully revealing the photograph inside. It showed a younger version of Harrison Campbell, White Pine Crossing's mayor, standing beside a beautiful woman with light brown hair and kind eyes, a woman Wicasa now realized must be the children's murdered mother. Now this is Eliza Morrison. Father O'Brien said, his voice filled with awe and growing horror. Harrison Campbell's daughter. I baptized her as a baby, watched her grow up in this church. When she disappeared 5 years ago, Harrison told everyone she'd gone east to visit relatives, but she never came back. I always wondered, she didn't go east, Wicasa said quietly. She married a Lakota man and was cast out by her father. These children are Campbell's grandchildren. The silence that followed stretched between them like a taut wire. Father O'Brien stared at the locket, then at the children, his face cycling through disbelief, understanding, and finally terror at the magnitude of what he'd just learned. Dear God in heaven, he whispered. Harrison doesn't know, does he, about the children's existence? Campbell disowned his daughter when she married for love, Wicasa explained. These children have been living in secret, hidden away, so he wouldn't have to face the shame of having mixed-blood grandchildren. But this locket proves their bloodline. It could save them if, through the sanctuary's front windows, they could see Sheriff Coleman and a group of armed men riding hard toward the building, their faces grim with purpose and their weapons ready for use. Someone saw you come here, Father O'Brien said, moving toward the door with obvious reluctance and growing panic. You have to leave, now, before they surround the building. But Wicasa made a decision that would change everything. Instead of fleeing, he pressed the locket firmly into Father O'Brien's trembling hands. "Keep this," he said with fierce intensity. "Show it to Campbell. Tell him what you've learned. These children are his blood, his family. If there's any decency left in him, any love for his daughter's memory, he'll act to save them." "But what about you?" O'Brien asked, his voice shaking. "I'll lead them away from here," Wicasa said, gathering the children in his arms one more time. "Buy you time to reach Campbell with the truth. There's a back way out." Father O'Brien pointed toward a small door behind the altar with a trembling finger. "It leads to the cemetery. You can reach the woods from there, but the children are too sick to run much further. Without treatment, then make sure Campbell gets that locket fast." Wicasa interrupted. "Because those children's lives depend on whether their grandfather has any love left in his heart." As Sheriff Coleman's boots rang against the church steps and voices shouted demands for entry, Wicasa slipped through the back door, carrying Campbell's grandchildren toward what he knew would be their final confrontation. Behind him, Father O'Brien stood holding the locket that would either save them all or damn them to an early grave. The choice was no longer in Wicasa's hands. He'd played his last card, revealed his final secret. Now all he could do was fight and hope that somewhere in Harrison Campbell's heart, love for family would prove stronger than the fear of social disgrace. The cemetery stretched behind the church like a field of granite monuments to frontier hardship, weathered headstones marking the graves of settlers who'd carved their lives from the unforgiving wilderness. Wicasa moved between the graves, cautiously keeping low as he carried the children toward the tree line that promised concealment, but also held its own dangers. Behind him, voices echoed from inside the church as Sheriff Coleman interrogated Father O'Brien with aggressive persistence. The words were too distant to make out clearly, but the tone was harsh, demanding. How long before they searched the building and found the back door? The children were growing heavier in his arms, not because they'd gained weight, but because his own strength was fading from blood loss and exhaustion. The bullet wound in his shoulder had reopened during his flight through town, soaking his makeshift bandage with fresh blood that left a trail any competent tracker could follow. Nita's breathing had become more labored, each small breath a struggle that tore at Wicasa's heart. The baby's fever was consuming her tiny body, and he could feel her slipping away with each passing minute. Her small hand, which had been clutching weakly at his shirt, had gone limp and still. No. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He pressed his ear to her chest, listening desperately for a heartbeat, feeling for the whisper of breath against his cheek. Nothing. The baby's fevered struggle had finally ended, her small body succumbing to the illness and exposure that had been consuming her. I failed her. The thought crashed through his mind with devastating force. I promised her mother I would keep her safe, and I failed. Just like I failed my sister all those years ago. The weight of that failure pressed down on him like a mountain threatening to crush what remained of his will to fight. But Ohanzi was still alive, still depending on him. The boy stirred weakly in his arms, his eyes fluttering open to focus on Wicasa's face, with growing awareness of their desperate situation. "Where's Nita?" Ohanzi whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why isn't she making noise anymore?" Wicasa's throat constricted. How do you tell a 4-year-old that his sister is dead? How do you explain that sometimes love and courage aren't enough? "She's gone to be with your mama," he said softly, his voice breaking despite his efforts to remain strong. "She's not hurting anymore, little warrior. No more fever, no more fear." Ohanzi's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded with that same stoic acceptance he'd shown throughout their ordeal. "Are we going to die too?" "Not if I can help it," Wicasa promised, though he wasn't sure how he could keep such a vow against so many armed men. He'd almost reached the relative safety of the tree line when disaster struck from multiple directions at once. Well, look what we got here." Tom Bradley's harsh voice cut through the morning air like a rusty blade, stopping Wicasa in his tracks. The bounty hunter emerged from behind a large family monument, his rifle trained steadily on Wicasa's position. Behind him, the two Garrett brothers materialized from concealment among the headstones, their weapons ready, and their faces wearing the satisfied expressions of men who'd successfully sprung a trap. But they weren't alone. More figures appeared from positions around the cemetery: Sheriff Coleman and his deputies, along with several townsmen who'd joined the hunt for the excitement and potential share of bounty money. They'd surrounded him while he was focused on the children's condition and his own grief over Nita's death. "Told you he'd head for the back door." Bradley continued, his voice thick with cruel satisfaction. "Rats always run when they hear the dogs coming, and this particular rat's been running all night long. Just put them kids down and step away, Indian." Coleman called from near the church, his voice carrying the false reasonableness of a man who'd already decided how this encounter would end. "You're wanted for horse theft and creating public disturbances. Come peaceful and maybe we can work something out." Wicasa said nothing, his eyes scanning the positions of his enemies with the calculating gaze of a predator. Bradley was 20 yards to his left, partially concealed behind a granite angel. The Garrett brothers had taken positions behind a large family crypt to his right. Coleman and his deputies were spread out near the church, blocking his retreat. But they'd made a crucial mistake. In their eagerness to surround him, they'd positioned themselves in a rough circle with overlapping fields of fire. If he could get them shooting at each other, the children are innocent. Wicasa called back his voice, carrying clearly across the cemetery, as he began to move not toward any escape route, but deeper into the maze of monuments. "They need medical help. That half-breed brat ain't our concern." Bradley snarled, tracking Wicasa's movement with his rifle. "And from the look of that baby, it's already too late for help anyway." The casual cruelty of the words triggered something cold and deadly in Wicasa's chest. These men would murder children out of pure prejudice, would let innocent lives end for the sake of $50 and their own twisted sense of racial superiority. "I don't let them get me." Ohanze whimpered, his small voice filled with terror as he saw the circle of armed men closing in. "Please don't let them hurt me like they hurt Mama." "I won't let them touch you," Wicasa promised, though he wasn't sure how he could keep such a vow against so many enemies. The first shot came from Bradley's rifle, but Wicasa was already moving, diving behind a tall granite headstone as the bullet chipped stone from where he'd been standing. He set Ohanze down gently behind the monument, positioning Nita's still form beside her brother. "Listen to me," Wicasa whispered urgently. "I need you to stay right here behind this stone. Don't move. Don't make noise. Can you do that for me?" The boy nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face as he cradled his dead sister protectively. "Good. Your grandfather is coming to help us. The priest is telling him about you right now. You just have to be brave a little longer." More shots followed, bullets striking the headstone and sending granite chips flying like deadly hail. But Wicasa was no longer where they expected him to be. Years of warfare had taught him how to use cover, how to move without being seen, how to turn a defensive position into an offensive advantage. He'd spotted what he needed during his initial survey of the area, a collection of loose stones that had fallen from damaged monuments, perfect projectiles for creating distractions. And the cemetery's layout, with its maze of headstones and memorial sculptures, offered dozens of potential firing positions. "Where'd he go?" One of the Garrett brothers called out nervously, his voice cracking with uncertainty. "I don't see him. He's behind them stones somewhere," Bradley replied, but there was less confidence in his voice now. "Fan out and flush him out. $50 don't spend itself." That was exactly what Wicasa had been hoping for. As the hunters began to move from their defensive positions, spreading out to search for him, they exposed themselves to crossfire from their own companions. All he had to do was encourage them to shoot at shadows. From his new position behind an ornate Victorian monument, Wicasa picked up a fist-sized stone and hurled it hard against a headstone 30 yards to his left. The sharp crack of stone on granite echoed through the cemetery like a gunshot. There! Deputy Franklin shouted, spinning toward the sound and firing wildly in his excitement. His bullet struck the headstone and ricocheted with a high whining sound, the deflected slug passing dangerously close to Sheriff Coleman's position. "Hold your fire, you idiot!" Coleman yelled, ducking behind his own cover. "You nearly took my head off." But the damage was done. The hunters were now nervous, jumpy, firing at sounds and movements that might or might not be their quarry. Wicasa used their confusion to work his way methodically around the cemetery's perimeter, always staying low, always keeping stone between himself and their guns. As he moved, the wind began to pick up a strong, steady breeze from the mountains that set the few remaining autumn leaves dancing and caused the branches of the old oak trees that surrounded the cemetery to sway ominously. Several of the larger trees had been weakened by disease and drought, at their roots shallow in the rocky soil. Wicasa threw another stone, this time to his right, causing two of the townsmen to fire simultaneously at different targets. Their bullets crossed paths in the air, one man's shot coming close enough to his companion to make him dive for cover with a curse. "Stop shooting at ghosts." Bradley roared, his own nerves beginning to fray as his easy capture turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse. "He's playing with us." But even as Bradley spoke, Wicasa was implementing the next phase of his plan. He'd noticed that Sheriff Coleman had positioned himself near an old oak whose trunk was split and diseased. The wind was getting stronger, and the tree was swaying more violently with each gust. A well-placed shot might be just what it needed to come down. Wicasa's rifle barked once the bullet striking the weakened trunk exactly where disease had eaten away the wood's strength. The tree groaned ominously, its massive bulk beginning to lean as the wind caught its crown. "Look out!" Someone screamed as the oak came crashing down with a thunderous roar, its massive trunk striking the ground with enough force to shake the entire cemetery. Sheriff Coleman dove desperately to one side, the tree missing him by inches as it crashed across the path he'd been using to approach Wicasa's position. The falling tree created chaos among the hunters, dividing their forces and blocking lines of sight. But it also gave Wicasa the opening he'd been waiting for. As the men scattered to avoid falling branches, he sprinted across open ground toward Coleman's new position. The sheriff was still recovering from his near-death experience when Wicasa reached him, moving with the silent speed of a hunting cat. Coleman had just enough time to raise his rifle before Wicasa's shoulder caught him in the midsection, driving him backward into a large headstone with bone-jarring force. The sheriff's rifle went flying as Wicasa grabbed him by the throat, pressing his own weapon against Coleman's neck. Around them, the other hunters froze as they realized their leader was now a hostage. "Now we're going to have a conversation." Wicasa said, his voice deadly calm as blood seeped from his shoulder wound and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. "About letting an innocent child get medical attention before it's too late." "You're insane." Coleman gasped, blood trickling from where his head had struck the headstone. "You can't fight all of us forever." "I don't have to fight all of you," Wicasa replied, pressing the rifle barrel harder against Coleman's throat. "I just have to kill you. And from this range with my rifle pressed against your neck, I don't think I can miss." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, both sides locked in a deadly equilibrium. The other hunters had their weapons trained on Wicasa, but they couldn't shoot without risking their leader's life. Meanwhile, Wicasa's strength was fading with each drop of blood that seeped from his wound, and he knew he couldn't maintain this position much longer. "Don't let them hurt me." Ohanzi's terrified voice carried across the cemetery from where he huddled behind the headstone with his sister's body. "Wicasa, don't leave me alone." The boy's cry cut through Wicasa's heart like a blade. Here he was playing a dangerous game with armed men, while the child he'd sworn to protect cowered in terror among the graves. Every second this standoff continued was another second Ohanzi went without the medical care he desperately needed. That was when salvation arrived from an unexpected direction. "Sheriff Coleman, stand down immediately." The voice that rang across the cemetery carried the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Harrison Campbell rode into the cemetery at the head of a small group that included Father O'Brien, Dr. Morrison, and several other prominent townsmen. Their horses' hooves struck the ground with urgent purpose as they approached the tense scene. But it was the silver locket gleaming in Campbell's hand that told Wicasa his desperate gamble had worked. The priest had shown Campbell the proof of his grandchildren's existence, and the mayor had chosen family over reputation. Mayor Campbell, Coleman said, weakly, relief evident in his voice despite his precarious position. Thank God you're here. This savage has gone completely mad. He's threatening to kill me over them half-breed brats. The only madness I see. Campbell replied, his voice cold as winter steel as he dismounted and approached the standoff, is grown men threatening to murder my grandchildren. The words fell across the cemetery like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of shock and confusion among the hunters. Even Tom Bradley lowered his rifle slightly, uncertainty replacing his earlier confidence. Your grandchildren? Coleman stammered, his face pale with pain and confusion. Campbell held up the locket so everyone could see it clearly, his weathered hands trembling slightly with suppressed emotion. The children this man has been protecting are the son and daughter of my late daughter, Eliza. They are my blood, my family, and under my protection. He opened the locket to reveal the photograph, inside his voice breaking as he continued. This contains a picture of Eliza and myself, taken 5 years ago before I made the worst mistake of my life, casting her out for marrying a man I disapproved of. These children have been living in exile because of my pride and prejudice, and now one of them is dead because of the hatred and fear that I helped create in this community. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if nature itself was holding its breath, while the truth sank into the minds of everyone present. But the bounty, Bradley said weakly, his voice lacking its earlier conviction, is rescinded. Campbell snapped, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. Along with all charges against this man. He risked his life to save my grandchildren when this entire town turned them away. He's shown more courage and compassion than any of us, and he'll be treated with the respect he deserves. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his medical bag in hand, and his expression professional despite the emotional weight of the moment. If I may, Mayor Campbell, the surviving child needs immediate attention. From what I can observe, he appears to be suffering from hypothermia and severe exhaustion. Do whatever is necessary. Campbell said firmly, his voice thick with emotion. Money is no object. Save my grandson. As Dr. Morrison hurried toward where Ohanzi waited behind the headstone, Campbell's gaze fell on Nita's still form. His face crumpled with grief as he realized that one of his grandchildren had died while he remained ignorant of their existence, too proud and prejudiced to see past his own narrow worldview. Wicasa slowly released his hold on Sheriff Coleman, allowing the wounded man to stumble away while keeping his rifle ready in case of treachery. But the fight had gone out of the hunters, their earlier bloodlust replaced by shame and confusion as they tried to process what they'd just learned. I'm sorry, Wicasa said quietly, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and grief. I tried to save her, but she was too sick, too weak. The fever took her during the night while we were hiding from your men. Campbell knelt beside his granddaughter's body, his hands shaking as he touched her cold forehead with infinite tenderness. What was her name? Nita Wicasa, replied, his own voice breaking. It means bear in Lakota. Your daughter said she was as fierce as a bear cub, always fighting to keep up with her brother. Tears ran down Campbell's weathered cheeks as he gathered the dead child in his arms, holding her against his chest as if his love alone could bring her back to life. I failed them both. I failed my daughter, and I failed her children. My pride, my fear of what others would think. I put all of that ahead of family, ahead of love, ahead of everything that should have mattered most. "You're here now," Wicasa said, simply swaying on his feet as blood loss and exhaustion took their toll. "That's what matters. Ohanzi is alive because you chose to act when it counted. Your daughter would be proud of that choice." As Dr. Morrison worked to stabilize Ohanzi and the other townsmen began to disperse in shame and confusion, Campbell looked at Wicasa with something that might have been respect mixed with profound gratitude. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you risk everything for children who weren't yours, who you'd never met before this week?" Wicasa was quiet for a long moment, thinking of his sister who had died so many winters ago, of the promise he'd made to a dead woman's grave, of the code his grandfather had taught him about protecting the innocent, regardless of their blood or heritage, because it was the right thing to do. He said finally, his voice growing weaker as consciousness began to slip away. "And because every child deserves someone willing to fight for them, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth." Campbell nodded slowly, understanding passing between the two men, despite their different backgrounds and cultures. As Wicasa collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion, the last thing he saw was Ohanzi's face alive, breathing, surrounded by people who would finally care for him as he deserved. The promise had been kept, though, at a higher cost than anyone had imagined. One child was dead, but one child lived. And sometimes, in an imperfect world filled with hatred and fear, that was enough to call victory. The funeral for Nita Morrison Campbell was held 3 days later in the cemetery behind White Pine Crossings Church, though it bore little resemblance to the battlefield it had been just days before. The storm-damaged tree had been cleared away, the scattered stones replaced, and fresh flowers decorated many of the graves in a show of community respect that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. The entire town attended, though their reasons varied widely. Some came out of genuine grief for a child who had died because of their collective failure of compassion. Others attended because Mayor Campbell had made it clear that anyone who didn't show proper respect for his granddaughter would find themselves unwelcome in his community. But regardless of their motivations, they were all there standing in the same cemetery where they had recently tried to kill the man who had saved one of their most prominent citizens' grandchildren. Harrison Campbell stood at the graveside, holding Ohanzi's hand, publicly acknowledging both children as his family and rightful heirs to his name and fortune. The boy was still weak from his ordeal, but Dr. Morrison's treatment had worked its quiet miracle. With proper food warmth and medical care, his body was rapidly healing from the trauma that had nearly claimed his life. Father O'Brien conducted the ceremony in both English and Lakota, honoring both sides of Nita's heritage, with words that spoke of love transcending the boundaries of race and culture that had kept her family divided and ultimately led to her death. Wicasa stood on Campbell's other side, his wounded shoulder in a sling, but his presence solid and reassuring. He had awakened the day before, weak but determined to attend the funeral of the child he'd tried so hard to save. The bullet graze was healing well, but the emotional wounds would take much longer to mend. As Father O'Brien spoke words of comfort and hope, Ohanzi looked up at the two men who flanked him. His grandfather, who had finally chosen family over reputation, and the warrior who had risked everything to bring him home. In his small hand, he clutched a wooden hawk that Wicasa had carved for him during his recovery, a symbol of the bond between them that would transcend distance and time. The transformation in Mayor Campbell was remarkable and genuine. The politician who had once valued reputation above family had become a grandfather willing to sacrifice everything for one small boy's welfare and future. He had already begun making changes to his policies and his personal life, driven by the knowledge that his pride and prejudice had cost him a daughter and a granddaughter. "The boy will live with me in my house," Campbell had announced from the town hall steps the day after the confrontation, his voice carrying to every corner of the crowded square. "He'll be educated, fed, clothed, and loved as befits any child of this family. He'll learn about both sides of his heritage, his mother's world and his father's world, and he'll be prepared to build bridges between communities that have been divided by fear and misunderstanding for far too long. The reaction in town had been mixed, as Campbell had expected. Some residents expressed genuine shame at their treatment of the children, and their protector recognizing that they had nearly been accessories to the murder of innocent children. Others grumbled about mixed-blood family members and questioned Campbell's fitness for leadership, though they did so quietly and away from his ears. But Campbell had made it clear that anyone who couldn't accept his grandson was free to find another place to live. White Pine Crossing would change its attitudes toward Native peoples and mixed families, or it would do so without his political and financial support. Given that he owned most of the businesses in town and held significant influence with territorial authorities, few were willing to challenge him directly. Sheriff Coleman, his head still bandaged from his encounter with the headstone, had grudgingly dropped all charges against Wicasa and issued a public apology for the manhunt. His authority had been severely damaged by the revelation that he'd been hunting an innocent man who was protecting the mayor's grandchildren, and rumors suggested he might not survive the next election. Tom Bradley and the Garrett brothers had left town the day after the confrontation, and their bounty hunting careers effectively ended by Campbell's influence with territorial authorities and the widespread disgust their actions had generated among the townspeople. No one knew where they had gone, and few cared to find out. But the question remained of Wicasa's future and what role he would play in Ohanzi's life going forward. "You're free to go wherever you choose," Campbell had told him privately after the funeral as they walked back toward the mayor's house where Ohanzi was staying. "All charges have been dropped, and I've written to the territorial governor clearing your name completely. Or you're welcome to stay here in White Pine Crossing if you can find a place for yourself in our community. God knows we could use more men like you, men who put compassion ahead of prejudice, who see children as children regardless of the color of their skin." Wicasa had considered both options during the 3 days of recovery and mourning. The boy had grown deeply attached to him during their ordeal, calling him Uncle Wicasa, and asking repeatedly if he would stay to help take care of him, to teach him how to track animals in the forest, to tell him stories about his father's people and their ancient ways. The attachment was mutual. During their desperate flight from the bounty hunters, Wicasa had felt something he hadn't experienced since his sister's death, and the fierce, protective love that comes from being responsible for an innocent life. The boy had filled a void in his heart that he hadn't even realized existed. But Wicasa also knew the reality of frontier life better than the boy did. Despite Campbell's support and the official clearing of his name, many residents would never fully accept him. The suspicion and mistrust would fade with time, but they would never disappear entirely. He would always be an outsider in White Pine Crossing, tolerated rather than welcomed. More importantly, he had his own people to return to, his own responsibilities and obligations that had been set aside during this unexpected journey into fatherhood and heroism. The Lakota bands in the northern mountains were facing a harsh winter, and they needed every experienced hunter and warrior they could get. On the morning after Nita's funeral, as autumn mist rose from the river that had carried them all to this crossroads of fate, Wicasa prepared to leave White Pine Crossing for what might be the final time. His horse, recovered from the bounty hunters, who no longer had any use for it, was saddled and ready. His few possessions were packed, his rifle cleaned and loaded for the long journey ahead. Ohanzi waited on the porch of his grandfather's house, trying to be brave, but unable to hide the tears that streamed down his face. The boy had grown thinner during his ordeal, but his eyes held a strength and maturity that hadn't been there a week ago. He'd seen the worst that humanity had to offer, but he'd also seen the best, and somehow he'd retained his capacity for trust and love. "Do you really have to go?" the boy asked for what seemed like the 100th time that morning, his voice small and pleading. "I have to," Wicasa replied gently, kneeling to meet the child's eyes at his own level. "My people need me just like you needed me when we first met in that ruined cellar. But that doesn't mean I'll forget you or that you'll forget me." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out something he'd been working on during the quiet hours of his recovery, a second carved wooden hawk, this one slightly larger than the first, and wearing a small leather pouch around its neck. The carving was more detailed than his previous work, showing the fierce beauty and noble spirit of the bird that had always been his guardian symbol. "This is for you too," he said, pressing the hawk into Ohanzi's small hands with the solemnity of a warrior passing on his most precious possession. "This one carries medicine in its pouch herbs that will help you remember your dreams and stay connected to the spirit world. Your father would have taught you about such things if he'd lived. Now I'm teaching you in his place." Ohanzi clutched both carvings to his chest, his tears flowing freely now, despite his efforts to be strong. "Will I ever see you again?" "I don't know," Wicasa answered with the honesty that children deserved, even when the truth was painful. "But I'll always be your friend, no matter how far apart we are or how many years pass between us. And if you ever need help, real help, the kind that family can't provide or law can't deliver, you send word to the Lakota camps in the northern mountains. Ask for Wicasa the Hawk Rider, and they'll know exactly who you mean." Campbell approached from the house, his own eyes suspiciously moist, despite his efforts to maintain composure. In his hands, he carried a leather pouch that clinked with the distinctive sound of silver coins, more money than most men saw in a lifetime. "This is for you," he said, offering the pouch to Wicasa with hands that trembled slightly from emotion. "Payment for what you did. For saving my grandson, for bringing him home to me when I didn't even know he existed, for showing me what real courage and compassion look like." Wicasa looked at the money, but didn't immediately take it. "I didn't do it for payment. I did it because it was right, because no child should die for the sins and prejudices of the adults around them. I know that, and that's exactly why you deserve it," Campbell replied firmly. "Accept it anyway, not as wages for services rendered, but as a grandfather's gratitude and a community's debt. Use it to help your own people to buy food or medicine or whatever they need to survive the coming winter. Consider it an investment in peace between our communities, a bridge built with silver instead of bullets." After a moment's hesitation, understanding the deeper meaning behind the offer, Wicasa accepted the pouch. The money would indeed help his people, especially with winter approaching and supplies running dangerously low on the northern reservations. "There's something else." Campbell continued his voice, taking on the tone of a man making an important business proposition. "I've written to the territorial governor recommending you for a position as a liaison between the native tribes and the settler communities. There are going to be more conflicts as more people move west, more misunderstandings and tragedies like the one we've just lived through. But maybe with men like you, building bridges instead of walls, working to prevent violence rather than simply react to it." He didn't finish the thought, but Wicasa understood the implications perfectly. The idea of serving as a peacemaker between two worlds that often seemed determined to destroy each other appealed to him more than he cared to admit. It would be dangerous work, often frustrating, frequently thankless. But it would also be meaningful in a way that simple survival could never be. "I'll consider it seriously," he said, meaning every word. "After I've seen to my people's needs for the winter, after I've fulfilled my existing obligations to my band and my family. Come spring, we can discuss what such a position might involve and how it could serve both our peoples." The farewell stretched longer than necessary, with promises to write letters, plans for future visits, and repeated assurances that Ohanzi would always have a place in Wicasa's heart, no matter where his travels took him. But eventually, with the sun climbing higher and the day growing warmer, Wicasa mounted his horse and prepared to ride away from White Pine Crossing. As he reached the crest of the hill that overlooked the town, he turned for one final look and saw something that made him smile with genuine satisfaction and hope for the future. Father O'Brien had emerged from the church and was walking toward the Campbell house, carrying what looked like fresh flowers for Nita's grave. But more importantly, several townspeople had joined him, including families with children, who seemed genuinely curious about the boy they'd heard so much about and the mixed-blood child who'd survived an ordeal that would have broken most adults and emerged with his spirit intact. White Pine Crossing was indeed changing just as Campbell had promised it would. The transformation would be slow, marked by setbacks and resistance from those who preferred their prejudices to the harder work of understanding and acceptance. But it was beginning, and at the center of it all was one small boy who carried the blood of two peoples and the hope of bridging the divide between them. 6 months later, a letter reached Wicasa at his winter camp in the northern mountains, delivered by a traveling preacher who made regular circuits through the territory despite the harsh conditions. The envelope was made of fine paper and sealed with the official stamp of White Pine Crossing's mayor, but the handwriting on the front was clearly that of a child. Written in careful script that showed obvious improvement from months of tutoring, it contained news that warmed Wicasa's heart like a campfire on the coldest night. "Dear Uncle Wicasa," the letter began. "Grandfather says you might come back in the spring to be a peace talker between our peoples. I hope you do, because I miss you every day, and I still have both of your hawk carvings. I talk to them sometimes when I'm sad about Mama and Nita, and I think they talk back, though. Grandfather says that's just the medicine working on my spirit, like you taught me. The town is different now, better in some ways, but also harder sometimes. People ask about you sometimes, and I tell them you're the bravest man I ever knew, and that you saved my life when nobody else would help us. Some of them still don't like Indians very much, but they're learning to be more polite about it, and some are even starting to ask questions about what Papa's people were really like. Grandfather says that's progress, even if it's slow progress. He's been teaching me about business and politics, but he also hired a Lakota man named Joseph Iron Crow to teach me about Papa's ways. Joseph says you're famous among the northern bands for what you did here, and that many people are telling stories about the warrior who carried 2 children across the river to safety. Dr. Morrison says I'm completely healthy now, stronger than ever. Father O'Brien has been teaching me to read and write in both English and Lakota, and I can say prayers in both languages too, which makes me feel closer to both sides of my family. Sometimes I dream about Mama and Nita, and they tell me they're proud of how brave I've been. But it's not always easy. Some of the other children still call me names sometimes, and their parents look at me funny when they think I'm not watching. When this happens, I remember what you taught me about the difference between strength and fighting. You said that a warrior's true strength comes not from fighting, but from knowing when to fight and when to forgive, when to strike back and when to show mercy. I've been thinking about that a lot, and I think I understand what you meant. You could have killed Sheriff Coleman and those other men in the cemetery, but you chose to use them to save me instead. You could have been angry at the town for turning us away, but you found a way to make them see that they were wrong. You taught me that family is not just about blood, it's about the choices we make and the promises we keep to each other. I want you to know that I'm trying to live up to the lessons you taught me. When kids are mean to me, I try to remember that they're probably just scared of things they don't understand. When grown-ups say ugly things about Indians, I tell them stories about you and Papa and how brave and kind you both were. Grandfather says I'm becoming a bridge between our peoples, just like you wanted. I hope your people are safe and warm this winter. I think about you every day, especially when I hold the hawks you made for me. Your friend always, O'Hansy Campbell. Hey, P.S. I'm making something for you too. Joseph Iron Crow is teaching me how to carve, and I want to give you something special when you come back. Enclosed with the letter was a small drawing more skilled than a child's usual artwork, showing clear signs of instruction and practice. It depicted a Lakota warrior and a little boy standing together beside a river, with 2 hawks soaring overhead against a sunrise sky. At the bottom, in both English and Lakota script, O'Hansy had written, "Some promises last forever, and some families are made by choice, not chance." Wicasa kept both the letter and the drawing close to his heart as he traveled the territory that spring, accepting the territorial governor's appointment as a native liaison and working to prevent the kind of misunderstandings that had nearly cost 2 innocent children their lives. The work was difficult, often frustrating, sometimes dangerous, but it was also deeply meaningful in ways that simple survival had never been. Whenever he felt like giving up, whenever the prejudice and hatred seemed too entrenched to ever change, he would remember a 4-year-old boy's trust and a promise made beside a dead woman's grave. He would think about the difference one person could make when they chose compassion over fear, understanding over hatred, love over the easy comfort of prejudice and division. Years later, when he returned to White Pine Crossing for a visit during the summer of Ohanzi's 10th birthday, Wicasa found a town still struggling with change, but undeniably transformed from the place that had once turned away 2 dying children. The boy had grown tall and strong, equally comfortable speaking English with his grandfather's business associates and Lakota with the tribal representatives who now came to town for regular trade negotiations. "You kept your promise," Campbell told him on the last night of his visit, as they sat on the porch watching Ohanzi play with children from both the white and native communities. "You saved him, and in saving him, you saved us all from becoming the kind of people who could let innocents die for the color of their skin." The promise was easy to make. Wicasa replied, watching the boy laugh with his friends as if tragedy had never touched his young life. "Keeping it was harder, but it was also the most important thing I've ever done. Some things are worth risking everything for, and the life of an innocent child is at the top of that list." On that final evening, Ohanzi approached with something hidden behind his back, a carefully wrapped bundle that he'd clearly been working on for months. When he unwrapped it, Wicasa gasped in genuine amazement. It was a wooden carving of a warrior and child walking together, but this one was far more sophisticated than anything a 10-year-old should have been able to create. The figures were lifelike in their detail, their faces turned toward a rising sun that had been inlaid with actual gold. Around the base, carved in both English and Lakota, were the words, "Family is choice. Promises are sacred. Love bridges all worlds." Joseph Iron Crow helped me with the hard parts. Ohanzi said, his face glowing with pride and anticipation. "But I did most of it myself. It's to remind you that no matter where you go, you'll always have a home here with us. And to remind you that you taught me the most important lesson anyone ever could, that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what's right, even when you are scared." As evening fell and the children were called home by parents who now saw past many of the artificial divisions that had once seemed so important, Wicasa knew that his work in this place had achieved something truly meaningful. The seeds of understanding had been planted and were growing strong, tended by people who had learned the cost of hatred and chosen a different path. White Pine Crossing was still far from perfect. There were still residents who harbored prejudice, still children who repeated their parents' fears, still moments when old hatreds threatened to overwhelm new understanding. But there was also hope now, and progress, and the living proof that people could change when they had sufficient reason to do so. The river still flowed past White Pine Crossing, carrying with it the memory of a desperate crossing and the promise of redemption fulfilled. And in the years that followed, when travelers asked about the wooden hawks that many of the town's children carried, they would hear the story of the Lakota warrior who had carried 2 children across the river to safety, and in doing so had carried an entire community from hatred toward hope.